So where the meeting controls just go. Here we go. Hey everyone. Sorry for getting started a bit late here. As always, we'll give everyone a few minutes to pile in, and then we'll start asking questions or answering questions, excuse me. All right, we do have one submitted question, but that user is not in yet, so I will hang tight on answering that. So for anyone that is in our, again, excuse me, my name is Will Pedersen. I run our support and success teams here. See some new names in our participants or our attendees list, excuse me. You guys can either type your question in the chat or the Q&A, or just use the raise hand function, and we can let you ask your question verbally instead of typing. So all three options are available for anyone to ask any questions today. So please let us know what kind of questions you guys might have. And happy to unmute you with the raise hand function, so you don't have to type anything out. I know for me, that's much easier. Jared, how's training going?
Well, training's going good. Still busy and still crazy, but it's been a good ride.
You guys are doing a beginner training in EST this week. Is that right?
Yep, beginner training in EST and associate certification in EST, as well as new hire training too.
Cool. All right, let me pull the. All right, so how do I expose the question we have submitted from, oh, John just arrived. Wonderful, I was waiting. So John, I'm gonna let you talk if you so desire, but how can you expose a workflow as a web service? Great question. Let me go ahead and get in my studio here and have a place for us to build in. All right, so let's create a flow here. All right, and so any flow, unless otherwise specified, and with some considerations for newer versions, which we should probably touch on here, can be called as a web service just by getting or generating its integration details link. So I'm in a flow that has no behavior, no inputs, outputs, or steps. But if I look at the top here and I click on integration, this is going to open a new tab for me. And this tab is going to be the integration details wizard. And this lets me build up a API endpoint to call this flow. If I can, the the two main differences here, the two main ways to call are as a service. I'm going to send in data and expect a response back, or kick off a workflow. It can be long running, and there's some variety in terms of the response data that we get back in that case. Or I'm going to call a flow or a page or a report or some other element registration as a UI element. So it's either really service or UI form. If I stick with service here for a minute and I click Show Service API, depending on the properties of the flow itself, really specifically in terms of its input data type or its input options, I'll get and post, where in certain configurations I'll only be able to call post. But what you'll notice is I get this URL, I can copy this into a new tab, and I can run this flow as a REST API. It doesn't pass in any values, it doesn't send me any data back, so it's not that helpful of an example. But if we come, now that this is us just generically calling a flow, we've called the workflow engine through an API endpoint, we made a GET call, and then we've gotten a response back, which is empty because we haven't set up any output data on our flow. If I come back to my flow and really quickly add some input data, so I'm going to add two integers called int1 and int2. I'm going to then find a add step. I'll then map in int1 and int2 to my add step. And then I'll come and use this helpful pick from current data selector to add an piece of output data. And then I'm gonna go ahead and save this. And now if I come and if I come and refresh this page, leave everything the same and click Show Service API, what you should notice now is there's two new parameters at the end of my call here for my GET, and then two new values on the request payload for my post. And if I do the same thing I did before, I can come in here, paste this, and I'll replace these zeros with an actual value and run this. It's going to run that flow, and it's going to send me the response back out of the sum of those two numbers. And that comes from the configuration of this flow, where on my start step, I added two pieces of input data. I passed those two pieces of input data to a step that adds them together because it's the add step, and then passes its output to my end step here. And then this API is meant to, if we see here, it calls this as a service. Contrasting that with UI form, where if I look at this, I can still pass data in, but you'll notice all these display settings. So I can call a form, I can control its location, background, do I include the portal bar, things of that nature. So flows can have forms or be completely synchronous. And then based on how you're going to call them, you're going to select service or UI form. And here, if I look at documentation, let's see, calling a flow as a REST service is going to be the document that should walk you through this. Any questions about this? I'll drop this in the chat here. Anything I can clarify about that for you, John? Nope. Okay. If REST handling, looks like. Sorry, I'm mute. Yeah, I do not hear you, sir. But if there's any, feel free to chat if you can't speak right now. But that's in a nutshell. That doc will walk through it in detail, but that in a nutshell is how to call a flow as a service.
Keith was curious what version you're running on. Will.
Yeah. Hey, Keith, I'm on. John, I'm going to go ahead and disable talking. If you want to ask a question later on, please feel free to just use create a WSDL Interesting. Let me jump to Keith's question, then I'll answer your question. Hey Keith, right now I'm gonna let you to talk to Keith if you'd like. I'm on 613. So Keith asked a question, which I will drop into the chat here. So I'm on 613 because I'm testing something out for an issue for a customer. If you are using multi-tenancy, then you currently need to stay on our 6th branch. And so if we look at our releases site, we can see decision 6 and decision 7. Multi-tenancy support is in process of being added to decision 7. So if you're using multi-tenancy, you need to stay on decision 6, which means you can get as current as 617 or 618 when that newer release is released in the next, I believe, in August. Right now, the plan is our current roadmap has multi-tenancy returning to decision 7 in December of this year, at which point you'd be able to run multi-tenancy in 6 or 7. So that's kind of that's what your upgrade path looks like right now, given the lack of multi-tenancy in decision 7.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, so we are looking to go to 6.17. So it sounds like that'll be good for a while.
Yeah. And I mean, this will be supported for quite a while, but it's just because of some platform changes, we've had to rewrite multi-tenancy, and we decided not to hold decision 7 for multi-tenancy to be added. And right now the roadmap has that being decision 7 fully supporting multi-tenancy near the end of this year.
Awesome. So also, if I could just ask one more question.
Please.
I know the legacy, you guys have made it really easy to upgrade from, well, to 6 and also to 7. Later in 7, is that still the case? Like, if we don't go into production with 6.17, will it still be just as easy to transition from a 5 to a 7?
It should be. Yeah, you should be able to just the upgrade from 5 to 7 or 6 to 7 is more involved than a normal upgrade because of some changes to how the application is hosted. Like it can run without IIS now, and so there's some more sort of considerations there that would help you sort of figure the right path out through support or with your customer success manager. But that being said, backwards compatibility is still a thing. The core workflow engine is still the core workflow engine. So there's more options in terms of how you host the application, and some changes in terms of us now needing we moved away from .NET Framework to .NET Core. So there's some dependency changes here that make it less of a one-click upgrade. But from a backwards compatibility standpoint, it's identical. It should be it is anything you would hit that does not work, that used to work, would be considered a product defect or a regression that we would jump all over to get fixed for you. There should be no design work required to upgrade.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean 6.17, everything's going great. So ideally we would be on that before we even jump to 7. But
right.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. All right, so John had a follow-up question, was how do you create a WSDL? So we were actually, we've been depreciating this functionality, and I don't think, John, looking at your email, I think that your team is on V7, and I'm pretty confident we don't have this capability in V7 anymore, given our move to .NET Framework. Let me look at something really quick. I don't think you can create a flow as a service anymore. You can call it as a, yeah. You can call, so in earlier versions of decisions, we used to let you call a flow as a get or a post HTTP request, or you could create a dedicated web service. And we have, because of our move away from .NET Framework, depreciated that part of our product. So now you really are calling a flow. You can call a service. You can call a web service from a flow. If you go to create data types integration, external services, you can add a web service reference in 7. Let me just double check that really quick to make sure I'm being 100% honest. 2 seconds here. Create data types integration, external service. Yeah, if I pull a 7 server over, you can see here, I've done the same thing, create data types integration and external service and add web service reference. So I can still call a web service from a flow, but I can no longer call a flow as a web service in version 7. And that has to do with a replatforming from moving away from .NET Framework to .NET Core. So right now, to call a flow, you're really talking about making an HTTP call into that flow. And you control the inputs and you can control the outputs, as we did in our example, by what data is defined on the flow input data here. I select the start step and look on the right-hand side, and what data is defined on the output step by selecting the red end step, and then looking at the output data here. That defines my inputs and outputs of this web service. And unless I go in and say I'm not going to allow this flow to be called, I will I'll be able to call this as a web service. Happy to give you the opportunity to speak again if you'd like to have a conversation about the fact that that capability does not exist in V7 and newer releases that we are moving away from, that we have made the roadmap decision to move away from calling flows in that manner. Who else has got any questions? You guys feel free to use the raise hand feature, and we can just answer live as needed. All right. Go ahead, Keith.
Thanks. Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify one piece with that. So if I have a flow right now that we've given to a customer and they call as a REST API and they need a JSON return, you're saying that we would actually implement that in a different way when we upgrade to version 7?
No. One in earlier versions of the product. Let me come in here. Let's see if I can get this to work on my local. Enable. Yeah. Let me come back and see. Okay, in the version your team is running, if you were to look under flow settings, so here I am, flow settings, service settings, there was an option here to create a service, and I could create a custom web service for this flow. So I can turn this on. I can click save. It'll compile some code for me because it's establishing a web service on my behalf. And if I come back to integration details now, I have the option under to call this as a WCF or a web service. And then I can show the service API, and I can view my WSDL here. I should be able to. One second. Where'd it go? Let's try that again. No, it doesn't like that. But either way, I could get a WSDL to call this flow. So if you have been giving your customers a WSDL to call the flow, then in version 7 that will no longer work. So I guess I might have to walk back a bit my previous backwards compatibility statement there. But if you've been providing them a normal like HTTP endpoint to call, like a REST endpoint,
yep, okay.
there's no change there.
Oh, perfect. Okay, cool.
Yeah, that pattern still exists. There's some changes into how we path things now. This might look a little different than some of the API endpoints you've seen us generate before.
Yep.
But the old pattern still works and it's fine. It's just that you can no longer call a flow as a web service because the workflow engine will not generate WSDLs or establish a web service for you in the way that it used to. So if you think about it from a direction standpoint, you can call a web service from a flow, but you cannot call a flow as a web service in Decision 7 and newer, because of the platforming change that we are undergoing on our move to be a containerized application.
Okay, that makes sense. That sounds like no impact for us, so that's good. Thanks.
Okay, so Carlos has got a question here. In decisions, I'll drop this in the chat here. Oh, Sabrina, you are here now. Okay, great, thank you. In decisions, the expression file references appears as file references and also as file reference entity. In which case does one or the other definition apply? So a file reference in its most general form is just a way to deal with a file object in a flow. And if we come here, let me add a file reference. So let's really quickly come here. What do we get if we search for file reference? File reference entity, file references, forms, form controls, file references. Yeah, I don't like that this is under forms. Because we should have I'm not sure who we have from our doc team on today, Andrew, but Andrew, we should have like or maybe we do have, but a sort of understanding the different file type options in decisions type doc. Just a note, if we have one, please let me know. So a file reference, Carlos, in its most general form is just a way to handle a file. And there's really two main ways to handle a file, either as binary or as like a byte array in a flow, or as a file reference. And in that case, decisions writes the file to the file system. And then as you use that file in the flow, the workflow engine sort of takes care of loading that file in when it needs it, as opposed to it always contributing or being, increasing the default like memory footprint of that flow. And the way I think about this is, you could imagine we're transacting on a very large like PDF file, and we're passing that, say, from form to form. In the normal pattern, you might have, if we looked at like a flow that was doing this sort of file transferring, not transferring, but like passing this file from form to form. If I add a form here, and I had a file download, we'll just call this, big PDF. The file output type here is going to be file data. So if I were to have a series of these forms, just copy this. And let me just put a create data step here. And here, this will be where I load in. Imagine this is some load file step, or I pull a file from an FTP server, or do something. Either way, whatever way, I get this big PDF here. And then I've got a series, like an approval chain type process, where I show a bunch of forms to users. As I pass the big PDF in, it's set up as file data. So this flow is always handling that file as a part of its data. It's actually got the actual byte array inside of its flow data. So, a workflow engine says a couple, 100 kilobytes or something, but now it's a couple hundred kilobytes plus the size of that file. So a file reference lets us handle files outside of the directly being interacted with by the workflow engine. So unlike here, where we get where we pass file references around, if we were to use file data around, file references lets us load that file off the file system only when we need it. So if I were to have a file download control, I might pass the file reference in the same way, but the form isn't passing that whole file in. It's only passing a reference to it, and that reference only gets used when a user tries to download it. So it's a more efficient pattern for handling files. which really shows its worth when we start talking about very large files. So that's normal file data versus file references, as we would call it. But a file reference can be extended to be an entity. And oftentimes when you have like a setup process folder step or a case, you want to add files to that case or to that ticket, whatever that thing might be. And a file reference entity allows you to retain that sort of load only when needed behavior of a file reference compared to file data, yet give it a folder context. And entities in decisions world have folder context. They live in the portal somewhere. They're in a case folder or a designer folder or a process folder or somewhere else, right? Entities have a property called entity folder ID. That thing is their folder context. And so what that allows you to do is still leverage folder context and file references together. Does that help, Carlos? Any follow-on questions based on that description?
Yes, maybe I am confused about this because you are telling now that the file reference by itself can be like a folder if you define it like a file reference entity.
It
can it like a folder.
Like if you think about it this way, if I'm going to create a case really quickly here. Where is it? Why are these not alpha sorted? Ugh. I'm going to create a case here. Now, if I want to, I know that this is a case, right? Whatever this case is, and I'm going to have a user upload files to this case, right? At some point. Now, one way to do it, which is the bad way, would be to say, all right, I'm going to create a thing called related files. And I'm going to find my file reference, which is file reference, and make a list. So I'm going to have this list of file references that are going to be saved into the data type itself as a list, right? Yeah. If I'm only using file references and I don't use file reference entities, I basically have to do something like this if I want to create a case and file list relationship, right? So I can say this case has these files. But you'll notice one of the things you get here is a warning that says this is fine, but this style of data saving is not going to be retrievable directly from the database. It's okay as long as you understand that, that's great, but this would not follow along in like a decisions best practice world. So, but I can still use file references here. I could have a form, that form could upload file references, and I could add those file references into my case test one database table. But if I want, the better way to do this is to add these as file reference entities. So I can still leverage file references, but use these entities. So if I built a flow to create a case, create new case. And then here I'm going to find my case test one create step. What we really want to do is a pattern. And let me add a form here. And on my form, I'm going to put a file upload, new file, and a button. And I'm going to take my upload file and change the output type from file data to file reference. Let's save this. And then here, I'm going to expose my extension data. So, and then I'm going to put in some garbage text for my description and my folder name, pick a parent folder ID here, which will be the designer folder I'm working in. But what I want to do is come to steps, in flow management, data, and there's a step here, add file references to folder. Now, this step is a wonderful step, and it actually will take the file references and turn them into file reference entities. And let me go ahead and map this. So I've got a single file upload, so I need to use build array. I'll select new file here. And my folder ID will be the folder ID returned from my case step. But to contrast this, I'll also pass in that the file reference added on this form into my into the data type itself. I'll go ahead and save this. Now I'll go ahead and run this. And let me select a file here. There's a log file. All right, so here's my case.
Mm-hmm.
So once if I use file reference entities, I give my file reference a folder context, which means if I look in folder view, I can see my file references here. It's available in the folder. So now I just can do normal fetching behaviors to interact with it. I can fetch it, I can update it, whatever. I don't have to deal with the actual data object itself. And so all of the main takeaway here is a file reference has no folder context. A file reference entity takes a file reference, uses our entity model, and attaches the two together, and allows a file reference to be a part of a specific folder, and would be our recommendation for best practice for handling files.
But in this case, you defined the file reference like file reference only, but it appears like a file reference entity.
I'm not sure I follow the last point you're making there.
When you define the file reference
yes.
definition, when you declare it and the structure of the case,
mm-hmm.
you define it like file reference, not like file reference entity. Because I cannot understand the difference between the expressions of it. Why sometimes the name is entity and sometimes it has not the name entity, the entity expression in the name.
It's all about, the only difference is folder context. A file reference doesn't live in the portal somewhere. It's added, it can be worked on by the workflow engine and transacted on, but you can't natively make it a part of a process, like of a case or some other thing.
Okay.
So an entity allows you to do that.
Okay.
And you can still let your users interact. Now, we did this by using this step, add file references to folder, which just happens to, I guess, only because we know it, turn a file reference into a file reference entity.
Because it's in a folder.
Yeah, correct. Well, not because it's in it takes the file reference uploaded on this form and then takes that file reference and adds it into a file reference entity. So now you have an entity that holds your singular file reference. And each time that allows you to the most control over interacting with, having your users interact with those files. Because now it becomes trivial for you to be able to say, show a form of all the show a multi-file download control that says like download all files. Because you can just fetch all the file reference entities from the current folder or from the specified folder.
Understand. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. All right, what other questions do we have today? Anyone else? Feel free to use the raise hand function. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Hey, Will, can you show me how to do the web reference for the 7? Because I think mine is a 7 version.
Yeah, are you trying to call a flow as a web service or call a web service from a flow? Those are going to be different.
Call a flow as a web server. We write application and calling the flow as a web service. So we don't want to pass in the input from the URL. We want to pass in as a window. You know what I mean?
Yeah, in 7, you can't call a flow as a web service. You can only call it as a REST call. One of the REST options, so get, put, post, delete, whatever the other one is.
Okay, input, I think.
But you can, like, if we go back to that flow that I built here, So here's our flow, and I look at integration. You can, when you call it as a REST service, you'll be able to see, like, you'll just need to make you're not going to be getting a WSDL to define. You'll just have to use like a HTTP library or something to call this, if you're calling this flow from another application.
Okay.
But it'll give you the get and post. Like, you don't have to pass URL params if you don't want to. You can make a post call in, and on the bottom it'll show you what based on the inputs defined on the start step, what the
So how did you get to here, by the way?
Yeah, if you're in this, you're building your flow, you're designing your steps, you're setting your input data on your start step, which you can see on the right hand side, or int1 and int2. And you're setting your output data on the end step, which you can see under named add one output.
Yeah, I got that part.
And then there's a link in the top here called integration. And if you
mine don't have that.
There's also a right click action. If you right click, go to run advanced integration, view integration details.
Okay.
You also might have a thing here. If we look, let me grab a flow here. In 7, you might have to do one other step here. Okay, I don't have one here, but I think it's because, did we move it? It might be here now. If you look on my screen.
Okay, I see it.
Are we doing it here? Okay, sorry, apologies. We've moved this in 7. Now it's going to be under publish as service, API service, top right hand corner, and view. View will take you to the integration details link in 7. Apologies. Andrew, can you confirm we call this out explicitly in our 7 docs, please? And if not, we need to ensure that we do.
Yeah, I see like you have now.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and then you'll notice it's going to be very similar here. So now we can get our call. And this is more of a Swagger-like view in version 7. And you can control how it gets called or say that it's not able to get called at all using none.
Okay.
But once you're in this view, you should be able to, on the right hand side, it'll show you the info. It should automatically generate the calls for you. So here's the post endpoint, and then here's the output type header, and then the output type JSON. Or this is the value pair. This is the JSON representation.
Okay, I think I got it.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Hey, so in a form, if I've got a drop down with say 3 options, right? And I want to have a rule tied based on the user's selection of what they choose in that drop down to hide or show 3 different grids.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the best way to build a rule that, hey, they show option 1, show grid 1. They show option 3, show grid 3.
I think you will have to do that.
Or I just can't wrap my mind around the best way to do that.
Well, I don't think you can use a truth. You guys are on 7. There's probably a better way to do this with active form flows on 7 than there is on 6, since active form flows are newer. Mm-hmm. Anyone on the end know more about active form flows than me? Let's walk through the traditional way to do this, I guess. Let's see. So we'd have a flow. That flow would have a form. We define that form. And then we would have like a drop-down list here, right? And then we'd have like probably a vertical stack or something. And inside this vertical stack, we'd have some grids, something like this.
Yeah.
And this thing we would name grid 1. And this thing we would name grid 2. And let's go ahead and we'll just make a static string list here of A, B, C. Okay. And then let's go and just put some background color on these grids. So this one will be red. And this one will be green. I put a third one on. Or is it just a weird? Okay. So what I would normally do here is I would I'd come down to visibility rule and I'd add new, say hide grid 1, and I create a new rule. And then I'd set up my input data of type string, which would be, selected item. And I would say if the selected item equals A, that'll return true. And update my inputs, bind my change from form input to form component, and then select my selected item data name from my drop-down list, run on value changed. And what I would do is apply, so I would say hide or show, hide if it's false, and grid 2. I think. Let's see what this does. Let's debug. So if I select A, one of them, okay, there we go. So if it doesn't equal A, I hide grid 2. And that's using that. Let me look at a form here on 7 really quickly.
But if I was using form controls and I wanted more than 2 results, what's the best way to do a rule with more than 2 outcomes?
I think it's going to be using these active form flows here. I don't want to do this. Let me get logged into a 7 server here really quick. Just a moment.
While you do that, Will, the best way to approach that, Jimmy, would be you'd create an active form flow. And within active form flows, you have access to all the controls and their properties in that active form flow. So like grid 1, the visibility of access to its visibility set, whether it's true or false. And so probably what you'd want to do is you'd want to have your drop-down list, you have your 3 selections, and then you have a truth table that compares, okay, is it A, B, or C? And depending on if it's A, B, or C, it outputs a true or false value that will then update the visibility on the output step of the active form flow. I think that would be the rough outline.
Yeah, so the truth table is the route to go then.
Correct. If you have more than 2,
that's kind of the missing link that I wasn't comprehending. I was trying to get a rule to have multiple outputs than just true false. So
gotcha.
Yeah, then you definitely want a truth table if you want those multiple return conditions.
Yeah, okay.
Because you can each row allows you to have a different output value. You can do it with the statement rule, but it's much cleaner to use a truth table to get that behavior.
Yeah, I just haven't, I'm not that familiar with truth tables yet, so I hadn't really explored that route. But yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Another way you could do it also, Jimmy, is using the string match step. I don't know what type of input type you're using for your dropdown list, but you can use a string match step that says, hey, if it equals A, it'll have another path that you then can connect to a create data step that turns that grid to be hidden. And you can use that one instead. But with that one, be careful using that one, is that one's not very scalable, because let's say later on you want to add, you have 7 more criteria. Well, then you have to go manually in that active form flow and then add those 7 paths to it. So it's not a scalable solution, but it is an alternative. We do advise using the truth table, because when you create that truth table once, you can easily just edit it if you have more paths. So, but those would be
Yeah.
the 2 options to go about your business problem.
Yeah, I think truth table is the route I want to go. Cool, thanks.
Does that give you what you need?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, got about 12 minutes left here. Who else has got questions? So form input data, form data, that's generic data, right? Oh no, it shows grid layout 1. Okay. I haven't played with these much. So let's put a drop down. I'm just gonna get this active form flow to work in version 7 if no one has any questions. So static A, B, C. All right. So active form flow, edit rule flow. That's wonderfully. So I think let's use it. We'll create a truth table here.
I got a random question for you, Will, though. Do
Uh-oh.
you happen to know where these edit rule flows are stored? Because I have no idea.
They're probably, I would assume they're hidden items in the designer folder. If I
Okay,
had to guess, which is totally what I'm doing right now.
gotcha. I'll test it out right now. I'm just curious because
They're probably hidden since because they have automatic access to the data of the form. That means they're like a private flow for the form. That means almost certainly they're hidden.
gotcha. Okay.
And there's selected item. So selected item equals. And then this will be A. We'll change our output data here from Boolean to string. This will be grid 1 or something. B grid 2. Neither is grid 3. And then what? String match. Ooh.
Yep, I just confirmed they are hidden folder or hidden items in the folder.
Okay, so if I want to hide the grid, I use Data Explorer, form data. Grid 1 is a form control data. Form control data.
An easier way to do that, Will, is you can
data.
expand that and you could say the selected, I think. No? Oh, wait, never mind. Sorry, you're doing the right. Keep doing it. I thought you were on the drop-down list, not the grid.
So I'm going to do, I guess I have to form data, grid layout. Do I have to change its value? I can't like, I bet I have to change its value, don't I? Selected item is the, where's that? Form data, combo box, selected item. String match is going to be the output of our truth table. We only want one result, so we'll say, oh, we don't have that anymore. Did they remove the stop on, nope, return only first result. There we go. It's clear I haven't been working in 7 months. Result. And then, so if I look at this thing, Data Explorer.
What I would do here, Will, is instead of doing the entire control, just give it a Boolean value of true or false, and then you output it to the form data grid layout visibility. Because see how it has a visible Boolean? So all you would need is the Boolean.
Okay. Okay, so viz will be false, and we'll say change value, form data, grid layout 1, visible. So we don't have to actually pass the form control back. We're just going to change its value, right?
Correct.
Okay. Selected, that's fine. Is blocking. Run at startup. Run on selection changed. Selected data flow is invalid. Okay. Let me make that grid a color so you can see it. All right, now debug. Rule flow, no match, no match. They all went no match. View input data, select item B. Oh, duh, I see. Let me edit my flow. This is an A, this is grid 1. What's wrong with you? Grid 1. For those of you, you won't be able to find this thing on 6, these active form flows. This is a new feature added into 7 to give you more dynamic control over your flow, your form at runtime. There it is. A. Oh, come on. I have to set it back, I bet. So there it goes. Then I never set it back. Okay, let's try this then. I'll set this to B. There we go. Now if I set it to A, it'll go away. But because I'm never setting it back, it won't ever come back. All right, there you go. Jimmy, I think this is, I've got 4 minutes left. That's I know I ran through that really quick, but we're using these active form flows, and what we're doing in here, and you can let him speak again in case he has any questions, Sabrina, if you don't mind. Why am I not getting the property grid to load until I click something? Is no one, can someone else confirm if they get the same thing on whatever version Innovation Test is on? In my active form flow, what I did is used form data. So if I look at Data Explorer, this is a form. This flow has private access to the form it's controlled on, and that gives you form data. And you'll notice form data gives me all of the contents of my form. I see grid layout 1, and I see combo box, which is our default name for our drop-down list. So I was able to access combo box selected item to pass into the truth table to inspect the value of the selected item. And I was able to pass our grid layout 1. I was able to interact with its Boolean, its Boolean for is visible in this create data step. So run something. In fact, really in this example, I don't even really need the truth table. I could just go straight to the string match step with a slight change. But create data 1 then says declare a Boolean, set it to false, and then use change value that says update form data, grid layout 1 visible to whatever the value of this is. And then it sets it to false, and that's how it actually gets hidden in that example. So again, this kind of stuff is only in 7. You get a lot more control over you can do a lot more dynamic content, dynamic rendering of forms in 7 using these active form flows, which you don't have in 6 and below. So cool. Thanks for forcing me to finally use one of those things. Yeah, it doesn't like that, but that's okay. I don't know that I like that it prevents you from saving it if there's any validation issues. That seems a bit excessive on my end. Okay, great. Thanks for the questions today, everyone. I think I'll go ahead and cut it off here since there's no other questions or hands raised, and we will talk to everyone tomorrow. All right, have a great afternoon. Thank you.